smaller guys in the back.
There you go. There you go.
Get behind the general here, right?
There you go. There you go. You ready? You ready? Go. Let's do this.
Well, good morning, everybody, and thanks for coming out, particularly somewhat early. We were just up in the House Committee and actually introduced the legislation that we were going to announce today, so we wanted to do those in close time approximation. So as Kansas moves ahead and we are back in the mode of encouraging growth and investment and jobs and opportunity, one of the things that we've begun to look at is what burden we can ease from a state government standpoint. For the vast majority of entrepreneurs, businesses, employers, the single biggest state-imposed burden, of course, is taxation. But the second biggest is the regulatory load that's carried on everything from, as the old saying goes, soup to nuts. There's a tremendous amount of regulation that's been imposed, and particularly that's been true since the 1960s, the Great Society era, where states and the federal government have substantially ramped up the amount of conduct that's regulated. This is not a new concept, and Kansas was actually one of the first states, long before the 1960s, but way back in the New Deal era, that adopted a concept called a legislative veto. It's the idea that when a government agency, an executive branch agency, issues a regulation that has the force and effect of law, that there ought to be a mechanism for the people's elected representatives in the legislature to review and, if appropriate, revoke that exercise of power to write legislation, because that's what regulations essentially are. Many states used that power over the years. It ramped up until the 1980s, and in the 1980s there was a series of court decisions that disabled those legislative veto mechanisms. In Kansas, ours came in 1984. There were about a dozen states that had these mechanisms on the books. All but one saw their check and balance of legislative oversight rejected by their courts. Idaho was the exception. It still has that tool today. And in response to that series of court decisions in states in the 80s, several states amended their state constitutions to restore what their courts had taken away, the ability of a legislative check and balance over agency regulations. Today, after weeks of working together with the leadership in both houses, we're announcing that we are going to propose that Kansans get the opportunity to restore that sort of check and balance to our Constitution, to authorize a legislative veto mechanism that would ensure that the legislature has real and meaningful oversight over how regulatory agencies use the power that's entrusted to them by law. We think it makes good sense in terms of assuring Kansans that there is a steady and reliable regulatory environment going forward. I think it makes good sense as a matter of basic democratic principles, that you ought to have elected officials with the real power to have the final say over what the law is. So I'm grateful to the Speaker, the President, their leadership teams for engaging in this discussion. I'll hand it over to President Masterson and would just say we look forward to this debate. There are a lot of sort of down-in-the-weeds proposals on regulatory reform in Kansas that you've seen in the legislature in recent years. This one really goes to the root of the problem. And the root of the problem is the legislature has been excluded from what has become in recent years, not just in Kansas but around the country, the principal method of creating state rules with the force and effect of law. With that, Mr. President, I'd turn it over to you.
I don't need to say much. I'll let you guys get to questions with the general, but I'd simply just add that in any free society, it's important to have the proper checks and balances, right? We all believe in generally the freedom of the individual and limited government, and with that you have to have the proper checks. And what this does, things tend to gravitate away from that over time, just like with redistricting that we're going to be dealing with, where things gravitate out of balance. You have to reset. This is simply resetting that balance and giving voice to the regulated through their elected representatives in the vein of regulation. So I'm just glad that it was brought forward and happy to support it. Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, and thanks for coming. You know, we all agree and appreciate the three branches of government that we have and how they interact and work together, have the proper checks and balances. That's how our system is set up. Unfortunately, over time, a fourth branch of government has arose, and that's government bureaucracy. And there's really not the checks and balances. And so what the Attorney General is bringing forward today is something that restores that checks and balances and allows the people of Kansas to have a say in how they're regulated. So we really appreciate this opportunity and look forward to the debate.
Questions?
So, let's go on to the same ballot as the abortion.
The way it's drafted, Martin, is introduced is the November of 22 ballot. That's a decision, of course, for the legislature to make as they work the measure.
Isn't it funny that this wasn't a problem for several decades until we had a Democratic governor again?
Actually, John, it's been a problem since the Roosevelt years, and Kansas had a fix for it until the 1980s.
You could have brought this amendment 20 years ago when you were in the legislature, whenever you were in the legislature. Any of these guys could have brought this amendment 10 years ago. Why now?
One of the things that's resulted, at least from the AG's standpoint, as a result of some really extraordinary legal matters over the last year, we've had the occasion to dust off and look at some old case law. I'd read Stephan versus House of Representatives many times. That's the 1984 case. But I hadn't really focused on what it was all about. So sometimes you discover that the old ideas are good again.
Can you give some examples of how this process has been abused that kind of leads you to this point?
Yeah, I think it's less a matter of the process being abused and more a matter of there simply is no check and balance that's functional over most agency regulations. I'll tell you, here, let me give you this perspective on it. You know, as a legislator, it just never occurred to me when I served years ago that there was a process that could be different and more effective for legislative oversight of rules and regs. It's just the way things were. Once I became an agency head, I was somewhat surprised that there wasn't more legislative oversight over how I or any other agency head uses delegated administrative authority. So we've started looking at possibilities and discovered there are about half a dozen states that have this mechanism on the books. It seems to work well. So I wouldn't go down the road of giving you a laundry list of here's what I think is wise, here's what's not. I would say more of, perhaps as the speaker suggested, I think our system has gotten somewhat out of whack because of the substantial growth of the administrative state in recent decades.
But how would you quantify that? I mean, have there been an inordinate number of regulations and rules that have been implemented? Have we seen trends going any particular way in Kansas state government that kind of supports your point?
I would put it a different way, perhaps. I would say that one of the most common complaints we receive, we have a role the agency does in the current administrative process. We review regulations for legality, not for wisdom, not for prudence, but for whether or not they fit within the statute that authorized them. And one of the most common complaints we receive is from folks who are unhappy, not so much with the legality, but perhaps with the policy decision behind a regulation. And we have nowhere to point them at this point, except back to the agency that made the judgment call.
Attorney General, would this only affect cabinet agencies, or would it be like regulations from the Secretary of State's office as well?
Or from the Attorney General's office, absolutely. It affects all of the executive branch agencies.
What about executive orders?
The way this is drafted, it applies to rules and regulations. It doesn't address executive orders.
Why does this look like a campaign issue rather than if you really wanted to get this thing passed, you put it on a ballot with the abortion and you get to conserve these people out? It looks like just purely a campaign thing.
No, it's trying to get some good public policy enacted, and I'll leave it to the folks behind me and others in both bodies to decide what ballot it ought to go on. We wrote it on the general election ballot.
Are you keeping it on this general election ballot? You guys that run the legislature? Let me turn this one on just a second on you. This allows you to veto regulations you don't like, or allows the legislature to do that. What about regulations that haven't been implemented? I mean, there's been some consternation from the Democrats about their inability to get the Secretary of State to adopt the regulations for the vote everywhere law that needed. So, I mean, is there a converse to that about regulations that aren't getting adopted?
I suppose if so, others can bring that forward. This is about ensuring that there's actual democratic oversight of the use of lawmaking power by executive branch agencies. But if others have, a related concept they want to bring forward, that's how the legislative process works. which of course is a pretty good illustration why the legislative process ought to be where ultimately these decisions about lawmaking reside.
Well, how much of this is driven in a general sense by what everybody has seen during the pandemic? And I realize we're talking about the Emergency Management Act versus regulations per se, but it seems like since the pandemic, we've had a ratcheting up of interest in various forms of legislative oversight.
Well, I can only tell you from my perspective. I'd leave to the legislators their perspective. Obviously, we're all focused on issues of oversight in perhaps a manner that we weren't a year and a half ago because of the extraordinary use of executive power. But this is not that issue. This is an issue that perhaps we've discovered as a result of having to deal with that issue, but this is an issue more generally of what should the lawmaking and rulemaking process look like in Kansas. And I think ultimately it ought to look much more similar to the legislative process than it does to the administrative rulemaking process. Anything else for the good of the order?
What would you say to people who say that would look at this and say this is the informal kickoff of the gubernatorial campaign?
Well, that would be an error to draw that conclusion.
But you are running for governor.
No, I didn't say that. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.